We have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
The African continent has a very compelling case, and that is what we are pushing for. We are not talking about the first question. We are not calling for the total abolition of the veto power. We are saying that if member states want to retain it, it should be extended to all permanent members.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan joined the call for reform, saying it was long overdue.
Dünya 5'ten büyüktür.
The world is bigger than 5.
Fast forward a few days to a briefing by the ambassador previewing the US priorities for the upcoming General Assembly's high-level week, and this question.
Why retain something you yourself have described as creating dysfunction? What purpose does the veto hold beyond giving countries a mechanism that often blocks broad consensus in the Council, most notably on the Middle East file, the DPRK, and Ukraine, some of the most intractable issues that have been before this Council? What purpose does this veto serve?
The veto power was created when the Council was created. And yes, we've had some serious issues with the use of the veto, because we use the veto on issues, all of us, that are of import to us. And so while I understand why other countries think the veto is dysfunctional, so I acknowledge their understanding that the veto is dysfunctional, and I acknowledge that we're not prepared to give up the veto, but countries can't make that happen until they're sitting in a permanent seat. So my argument to countries is, don't demand what you think is dysfunctional, demand to work within the system to figure out how to change that. And I don't know how to make that change happen, but I do think increasing the number of permanent seats on the Council will make the Council more inclusive. It will bring added voices to how the Council functions, and it will bring additional regional interest to the table. So yes, we have made a decision, like others, that we're not ready to give up on our veto power, but we're willing to listen to what others have to say on that, and we'll see where it carries us.
Africa demands equitable representation in all UN decision-making organs, particularly the Security Council. By ensuring Africa's voice is heard, we can legitimize the UN's work and truly implement decisions that benefit the continent. Continuing this unfairness, we marginalize an entire continent that is highly important on the Security Council's agenda. Africa boasts a population of over 1.3 billion people, and its 54 countries represent about 28% of the total UN membership.
In recent declarations, public declarations, I've seen the permanent members being favorable to at least one African permanent member. The United States said so, the Russian Federation said so, China has been positive in this regard, the UK and France too. So for the first time, I'm hopeful that at least a partial reform of the UN Security Council could be possible for this flagrant injustice to be corrected and for Africa to have at least one permanent member in the Security Council. It is not guaranteed, nothing that of course depends on the Secretary General, it depends exclusively on member states, on the General Assembly, but for the first time I think there are reasons to be hopeful.
The ambassador was then first pressed on Washington's view of Russia's use of the veto on the Ukraine file.
It's been a problem. You have a country, a permanent member of the Security Council, who has broken every single tenet of the charter by invading a neighbor, actually compromising the sovereignty of that country and the borders of that country. And that country sits on the Security Council with a veto. So it is problematic.
Against.
And then on the US use of the veto on the Palestinian file, most notably the ongoing war in Gaza. And the response was illuminating and unapologetic.
We use our veto to promote the interests of the U.S. government, and that's how we've used that veto consistently over many, many years in the Council. And yes, people think it leads to dysfunction, but for us, it is power that we have, and we do use that power. I'm not going to make any excuses for it. It is something that is within the toolbox of things that we can bring to the table in the Security Council. And let me be clear on the issues related to the Middle East. We want to see peace, and that's what President Biden has worked for.
I'm pleased to deliver these initial remarks on behalf of the members of the African Union Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, namely Algeria, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, Libya, Namibia, Senegal, Uganda, Zambia, and my country, Sierra Leone. We are joined by A3+ members, Guyana and Mozambique. After nearly 80 years since the establishment of the United Nations and its Security Council, its imbalanced structure of bygone eras persists, undermining the legitimacy and effectiveness. It is therefore fundamentally important to address the issue of non-representation and underrepresentation of Africa in both the permanent and non-permanent categories of the Security Council, respectively. The current lack of representation in the permanent category does not reflect the current global landscape, and it is fundamental to consider the structural changes for its rectification. Additionally, it is significant to evaluate the Security Council's performance and legitimacy to ensure its effectiveness in addressing global challenges. It is deeply saddening to see the continued impact of historical injustice on Africa, and we must acknowledge and address these issues.
Security Council reform continues to be under the purview of the intergovernmental negotiations in the UN General Assembly.
And while it's unclear how the US position as expressed here will play itself out in the IGN negotiations, that process is moving at a snail's pace, with the prospect of a final formulation for a reformed Security Council not expected anytime soon. Despite the avalanche of support and urgency we'll hear from heads of state and government when they speak at the UN next week. The common position of the African Union on reform, contained in the Eswatini Consensus, calls for at least 2 permanent seats for the continent, and that as long as the veto exists as a matter of common justice, it should be made available to all permanent members, which, at least according to the United States, appears to be a pipe dream.
This was the US envoy last week after she announced Washington's support for 2 permanent seats for Africa on a reformed UN Security Council, but critically without veto power.
We have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
Fast forward a few days to a briefing by the ambassador previewing the US priorities for the upcoming General Assembly's high-level week, and this question.
Why retain something you yourself have described as creating dysfunction? What purpose does the veto hold beyond giving countries a mechanism that often blocks broad consensus in the Council, most notably on the Middle East file, the DPRK, and Ukraine, some of the most intractable issues that have been before this Council? What purpose does this veto serve?
My country has sparked the first ever debate in the Security Council, occurring at a critical time on addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. This debate was essential to spotlight further the urgency of rectifying the historical injustice that has significantly hampered Africa's capability to contribute effectively to the global governance stage, on the global governance stage, and further engage in productive discussions in enhancing the Council's effectiveness and legitimacy. The CGTN has demonstrated a strong commitment to addressing the historical injustice and inequality of the Security Council on Africa. The CGTN will continue to amplify Africa's voice on this matter in advancing the common African position as outlined in the Ezowini Consensus and SAT Declaration. We are pleased to note that the common African position has received wide support within the reform process. I therefore register our profound thanks and appreciation to the member states, interest groups, and regional groups for their continued and unwavering support for Africa and the common African position in the intergovernmental negotiations at the UN General Assembly. There is general convergence that redressing historical injustice against Africa is viewed as a priority. Several delegations have also mentioned that Africa should be treated as a special case. We are also pleased that the IGN's input to the Pact for the Future to be adopted during the Summit of the Future in September conveys the same imperative message, addressing historical injustice as a priority and treat Africa as a special case. What is now clear to us is the need to take the significant next step. The engagement and discussions have gone on for far too long. We have no doubt that the Council needs reforming, and the common African position has received wide support. It is time to take the next step and put the actual reform of rectifying the historical injustice against Africa.
The veto power was created when the Council was created. And yes, we've had some serious issues with the use of the veto, because we use the veto on issues, all of us, that are of import to us. And so while I understand why other countries think the veto is dysfunctional, so I acknowledge their understanding that the veto is dysfunctional, and I acknowledge that we're not prepared to give up the veto, but countries can't make that happen until they're sitting in a permanent seat. So my argument to countries is, don't demand what you think is dysfunctional, demand to work within the system to figure out how to change that.
And we want to be, Africa deserves a place to be a permanent member of the Security Council. And confidence, we are sure. It's a matter of time. Of course, the gatekeepers will find it difficult to let us in, but as you can see, there is already willingness, and we are gradually inching towards the next steps that we are talking about in order to be able to reach our goal of being a member of the Security Council. So we are very sure that with the support of member states, the C10, and the whole of Africa, we have a genuine and compelling case, and we have a model that we have presented, and we are sure about getting in.